Hi, everyone. I'm back with my friend Dr. Jonathan Cook. Today we are going to be talking about Jack London's. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Jack London's, A Son of the Sun. And just for those of you who are interested, cannot find this book on any of your audio streaming websites, I actually was able to record a version for you that I'm currently uploading as Dr. Cook and I speak. So hopefully that will be available to you within 24 hours. And I think we should jump right into it. Dr. Cook and I were chatting a little bit before I hit record here, and I think we should just start off. Why should anyone read this book? What do you think, Dr. Cook?
Yeah, well, this is a book to read after you've read the South Sea Tales. London wrote a few dozen stories about Polynesia. It was one of the two areas that is identified with his fiction. First being the Klondike, where he went as a young man in his early 20s, and then the South Seas, where he sailed on his ship, the Snark, the cruise of the Snark, in 1907 to 1909. So this is the second collection of South Sea Tales that he published. And it really has, there are 8 stories in it. They were all published independently and then put out in book form. And some of the same kind of themes carry over, colonialism, early 20th century colonialism, because England, Germany, France, the U.S. all had a hand in exploitation of resources in the South Seas, and the U.S. certainly with Hawaii. These stories, a lot of them are very entertaining to read, and they're very interesting for the characters they present. There's some wonderfully colorful characters, and also an image of the European and the American in a colonial setting that kind of reminds you of Conrad, which is the obvious comparison there in some of his stories and novels from the late 19th century, early 20th century. But of course, Conrad is much more kind of brooding and has a kind of generally darker approach to the subject. London is often very funny, but he takes on serious themes, and a lot of his stories involve evil doings of white Europeans against native peoples, evil doings of white Europeans or Americans against other white Europeans or Americans, and sometimes evil doings of native peoples against Europeans and Americans. So it's kind of like everyone is shown to be a fully morally formed human being. He does not pick one particular nationality or type to be his favorite. But he does create a character, this guy named David Grief, who is a character in all these 8 stories, and is kind of the unifying thread throughout these stories. And he is kind of an idealized figure of London himself, I think. But he's an Englishman. He works out of Sydney. He's an entrepreneur. He's a trader. He's about 40 years old. And he's called the Son of the Sun because he's a white European, but he doesn't get destroyed by the sun physically or morally. So he tans well, even though he has, blonde hair. And he stays fit. He's not an alcoholic like a lot of the people end up in these stories. And he's a fair dealer, so he doesn't exploit the natives. He doesn't exploit the people he trades with. So he owns these trading stations around Polynesia, Melanesia, and a fleet of ships to carry goods from one place to the other, and what these Europeans and Americans are getting from the natives is copra, which is a kind of dried out coconut meat, and also pearls from some of the pearl atolls. They have a lot of pearl diving capacity, and you have something called bêche de mer. So a few of these items, but very valuable in the trade. So, reading London is very enjoyable to read because it's great storytelling, great vivid characters, great plotting, and London was a master of the short story. So this is basically a collection of short stories, and it has a unified feel because of the carryover of this character David Grief. So
yeah, we'll be talking about him
yeah
more throughout our discussion. Perhaps we should enumerate the stories that are within this text, and maybe we could say a little bit about them as well.
Yeah. So the 8 stories are A Son of the Sun, The Proud Goat of Aloysius Pankburn, The Devils of Fuantino, The Jokers of New Gibbon, A Little Account with Swithin Hall, A Gobato Night, The Feathers of the Sun, and The Pearls of Parlay. So, all these titles are very colorful and they're kind of mysterious. Like, how does this title fit into the story? I mean, obviously, a story like The Devils of Fuatino, you're expecting some kind of nasty confrontation of characters, usually with violence and weapons. But then you have these humorous stories, The Proud Goat of Aloysius Pankburn, The Jokers of New Gibbon. I mean, all of this involves an element of humor, although, as we were talking about earlier, the Jokers of New Gibbon is absolutely, black humor. I mean, it's hilarious, but it's just appalling what happens because it's takes place on the Solomon Islands, where notoriously cannibalism was still a residual practice, and this is an area called Melanesia. So the natives, like Fiji, Solomon Islands, they're darker. They have kinkier hair, and these people are noticeably a little more primitive, so to speak, and their interaction with white traders tend to be more violent. The Polynesians, this is less of an issue because they've been trading with Europeans longer. So the Jokers of New Gibbon is a hilarious story, but also a reminder of the depths of depravity in human nature. Because of the Europeans think they're playing a joke on this cannibal chief or ex-cannibal chief who has given up liquor, and they give him things that he thinks are alcohol and turn out to be terrible tasting as a joke, a practical joke. So what they think is a practical joke on this guy turns out to be a deadly mistake in terms of the future of the two white men who play this joke. So, you have those kinds of funny stories. You have kind of action-adventure stories like A Son of the Sun. The first story is about David Grief's attempts to collect a $1,200 debt from a couple of traders who are trying to skip town without paying him in their trading. So David Grief shows up on their ship, paddles up to their ship as they're trying to leave, and there's a kind of violent confrontation. And the story is about how this guy David Grief is able to collect this debt by tricking the two guys, well, Griffiths and his German associate Jacobson, into paying this debt by luring them to a location by setting up false lights at night and making them think that they're they're sailing into a port where they're familiar with when they're really going into a trap. So that's good adventure writing, but it also has it's a depiction of these decadence and decline of these traders who just can't hack the life of dealing with all the things you have to deal with in terms of the weather and the sun and the native peoples and whatever. Um, and then you have interesting stories about racial prejudice. There's a story called A Gobato Night about um, a bunch of traders who were in a station one evening, and there's a sort of a half-breed, so to speak, character who is half Chinese. His name is Peter G. And there's a prejudiced character named Deacon who's an Australian, and apparently the Australians have a very firm sense of racial superiority, and so this guy plays Peter G in cards and loses, and then basically blows all the money that he has and that he had brought with him with his business, and so he has to go to work for David Grief, and it kind of humiliates this racist Australian into realizing the error of his ways, and it's sort of a kind of a therapeutic process of this guy losing all his money and then realizing what an ass he's been. Other stories about racial prejudice. The Pearls of Parlay, the last story, is about a pearl dealer who lives on a remote island or atoll and decides he's going to sell out all his pearls, but he times his final sale with the onset of a huge typhoon storm, and so all the traders arrive there, and basically he's kind of getting vengeance on the world because his daughter, who's a half Polynesian, half European, has been rejected by white society, and he's humiliated, and she's his only daughter, and so he decides to just get revenge by having all these people arrive in the midst of this terrible storm that kind of reminds you of the storm scene in the first story of South Sea Tales called The House for Mapui, which also involves traders arriving for some, buying up some pearls. It's a nice variation of themes, some lighthearted, some very profound, and recognizing the evil in human nature. And but the thing about London, he always keeps the story going. Things never drag. The characters are all very crisply delineated. He knew the scenes he was writing about because he had been through there on the Snark in 1907, 1908, 1909. He had to end his trip prematurely because he got so sick around in the Solomon Island area. He got this thing called yaws, which is a terrible skin infection with the same related kind of creature that causes syphilis, the spirochete. And the only way he got treated for it was with this mercury compound that eventually got into his body and destroyed his kidneys. So that's why he died at the age of 40 in 1916. So he knew the scenes he was writing about from spending, a year or two sailing around, meeting traders, and meeting native people. He spent a good amount of time in Hawaii before he went down to Tahiti, and then west to some other parts of the Pacific.
Well, something I was thinking about just as you were retelling the stories within this text, the there's like a financial game of chance dimension to many of these stories as well, which I found pretty intriguing.
Yeah.
Has anyone done any sort of commentary on that?
Well,
Whether it's the games of the betting or the way
yeah.
that inflation works on the islands or the nature of the trading or the
Yeah. Well,
I mean I don't know if it was in the Aloysius Pankburn
well,
where
it's about the guy who's, he's an alcoholic, and the guy
yeah
forces him to go through this regime, this training regime, and he's offering David Grief the chance to find this kind of hidden treasure that
right
he supposedly knows about through his family connection. So it really reminds me of the tradition that, I don't know if it was begun with Rudyard Kipling of Captains Courageous, of the wealthy young man, or in Captains Courageous, in that sense, it was a teenage boy, but it's the idea of this wealthy, privileged young man who's um, forced to encounter the struggles of life and mature because of some unexpected association with the sailors. I mean, in Captain's Courageous, the kid he's picked up by these fishermen of the North Banks, and he has to spend time fishing with them. His wealthy parents, are on this cruise, and they don't know where he is. And in the Sea Wolf, Henry Van Lyden is picked up by this Captain Larson, who's the Sea Wolf, and he has to kind of submit to the brutal regime of this captain. So it's the same thing with this guy Aloysius Pankburn, who's a spoiled 30-year-old alcoholic who's from a wealthy family who has to kind of reform himself. And David Grief, he becomes kind of his athletic coach to get him off the sauce. So it's a kind of a lighthearted story, but with a legitimate theme of overcoming the decadence that is promoted by wealth and too much
well I enjoyed the
leisure.
story of when they had to get the treasure back
Yeah,
from the natives. I really liked that.
yeah,
I thought that was really clever.
yeah. He's got there's some great plot twists along the way.
Sure. Well, let's talk a little bit more about David Grief. I mean, when I was reading this, obviously the name David Grief
Yeah,
struck me as symbolic. I hadn't had too much time to think about it, but
yeah.
why don't we
Well,
talk
I
about
think he's a 40-year-old Englishman who lives in Australia, and wealthy. I mean, he's kind of an idealized image of Jack London in that he's white, but he can go native whenever he wants. He looks, he's got the native coloring. His skin doesn't get sunburned; it gets tanned, and the name David kind of you think of David, the biblical David.
Sure.
This charismatic leader, figure, warrior, sensitive, creator of the Psalms or whatever. The idea of grief doesn't really match his character. I mean, he's not a melancholy figure. Maybe it means that he is he knows how to deal with the struggles of life. He's kind of been through grief, not in that he's mourning people, but people give him grief, and he gets around it without losing his temper. And so he puts up with a lot of stuff from other people just to be fair. I mean, he's an eminently fair-minded character, and He has a kind of interest in finding the best in people, even in some of the horrible people he deals with. So
Well,
yeah,
I would think just off the top of my head, when I think about David, I think of King. You know, the same David
yeah,
you're talking about from the biblical uh, background, but I think of it as like King David or King Grief. So I wonder if there's some sort of message there about self-abnegation and taming,
yeah,
taming one's response to
yeah,
struggle and grief. I don't know.
yeah. But there's nothing in his life seems to occasion any kind of terrible sadness, and we really don't know anything about his personal life. We don't know. He doesn't seem to have a wife anywhere, and he. He's very clever. He's kind of an Odysseus figure in the tricks he can play. He tricks characters. He tricks the guys in The Son of the Sun, this guy Griffiths and Jacobson, into paying the debt that they owe, or that Griffiths owe him. So like Odysseus, very clever in his creation of illusions, and he also tricks in the story called The Little Account with Swithin Hall. He tricks these three guys, or this guy, Captain Raffi, who's exploiting the pearls on the island that is owned by Swithin Hall, who has cheated David Grief's first mate, and out of $60,000. And he manages to get his first mate's money back, $60,000, by pretending to be this guy Swithin Hall, the owner of this Pearl Atoll that is being illegally exploited by these three kind of renegade seal hunters while the guy is away from his island. So David Grief pretends he's Swithin Hall and says, "I'll take you to Australia because your boat is sunk. That's why you're here, partly because you can't get away. And if you pay me all this money from the pearls that you've been harvesting on the island," which he's going to give to his mate, who wants revenge against Swithin Hall. So again, you have David Grief being a trickster figure and doing a good deed for his first mate. Who is let's see, his name is Snow.
It's
So
it's interesting that you see him as a Odyssean figure because in Kubrick's 2001: Space Odyssey, the Odyssean figure there, the Ulysses figure, is Dave Bowman.
oh
Right?
really?
And there's all sorts of things going on with the name Dave Bowman, and it makes me wonder if there is this shared understanding of some connection between David and Odysseus.
Well, I
Since
know
it's
David was a bit of a trickster because he did trick Saul, by he went up to him, and what did he do? There's a famous incident where David, what does he take something from Saul when he's standing next to him and he doesn't know it, and so David has this wit about him, but obviously Odysseus is the one who's known for being the supreme guy who can trick his way out of danger, famously with the Cyclops. So yeah, I don't know exactly why the name Grief is used. Maybe there's something personal there. Maybe London met an Australian with that name and thought of him as a good model for that character, because London was in Australia at the end of his cruise in the hospital to recover, and then he covered a famous prize fight there, heavyweight championship that was taking place at the time, as a journalist as well, before he left to go back to the U.S.
Very interesting. So we've touched a little bit on the composition, but there's probably more to say. I mean,
about when.
What do we know about when and
Well,
where and how he put this together?
well, he just churned out stories. I mean, London was constantly writing. He tried to write 1,000 words a day. And during the cruise of the Snark, he was churning out fiction. He wrote Martin Eden when he was on the cruise and published that in 1909 when he was just getting back. So after London returned, he was living in California. He had his ranch in Glen Ellen, California, about an hour north of San Francisco. A really beautiful place I've been to, and I encourage anyone to visit there. It's a place you can go and see, the ruins of his stone house that burned down, and his grave and Charmian's grave is there, and you just see the beauty, the stunning beauty of this landscape there in just north of San Francisco. So he's living there, and he had a fairly expensive lifestyle because he was taking care. He had two daughters from a previous marriage. He married this woman Charmian, who was his very important wife, who helped him with all kinds of projects and with his writing. And so he was living there and traveling, going occasionally to other places, but cranking out stories. 1911, 1912, he published the stories that made up this book, which is published in 1912. So it's, the residue of his travels in the Pacific that ended in 1909, and that would continue with more stories based in Hawaii. He has a collection called The House of Pride, some wonderful stories set in Hawaii. And then towards the end of his life, he went back to Hawaii for 8 months and published some more stories about Hawaii in one of his last short story collections. So the South Seas and the Pacific and Hawaii were all really vital to his career as a writer. Most people think of Jack London as the author of to build a fire, or the Call of the Wild, or White Fang, all these tales of the far north. But he's also the poet of the South Seas. It's kind of interesting, that dichotomy there between the freezing north and the and the sunny south, and the ocean and the land.
Yeah, what do you think accounts for that? The fact that he's best known for musings on the North rather than.
Well, I mean, he wrote some fiction about San Francisco, the Oakland area. I mean, he produced a very entertaining, hilarious collection of stories about his early days as a teenager working on the California Fish Patrol, policing fishing in San Francisco Bay. The stories are called Tales of the Fish Patrol, and I recommend anyone to read them if they want to really laugh and be entertained. And of course, his story. He wrote a novel, the Valley of the Moon, about a couple who were living in Oakland and are struggling to improve their lives. The woman, they get married, and the guy is working as a teamster, and it's a semi-autobiographical story. So he's got a chunk of his work that takes place in the San Francisco area, and it's great work. But I guess there was more kind of possibilities for vivid storytelling in these areas where the weather was more extreme, and where different cultures were rubbing against each other. The far north, it's the native peoples and the Canadians and Americans all mixed up together. And Polynesia, it's the Americans, Europeans, and Asian, peoples and Polynesians all all mixed there. So that's one of the great interesting things about this fiction is that it takes you back, over 100 years, but you're still dealing with the problems of, how does everyone get along with each other? How does the sort of felt superiority of the white race play out in terms of the treatment of native peoples? And that's a timely subject.
Right. Well, we've sort of addressed this a little bit already in our conversation, but the main themes of A Son of the Sun. I mean, it's a text filled with interesting insights on racial dynamics and colonialism.
Yeah.
But so I imagine we're going to want to talk about that a little bit. But were there other themes outside of those two that you wanted us to direct
Well,
our attention to?
I mean, there's kind of there's an exploration of sort of evil in characters. Wow, mixed up with greed. I mean, it's kind of a Conradian theme. What drives these people? It's the evil of the exploiters that drives their the greed of trying to get something for the cheapest price or to use violence and coercion to make people work for you and but for London, evil is kind of an equal opportunity activity. So you have the balance between white people mistreating natives, mistreating other whites, and then you have this Solomon Island reformed cannibal who kind of reverts to his old sort of absolutist thinking and goes back to his cannibal ways because the Europeans are trying to play a joke on him because they kind of think of him as kind of a fool because of his he's kind of a diminished guy because he's supposedly given up his cannibal ways, and he's now resigned to dealing and trading with these Europeans, and it just shows the sort of the thin crust of civilization that we all uh, know is there. It's very much Joseph Conrad's idea of human nature. Civilization is a veneer, and below that you find the
You
beast.
think we're this far away from cannibalism?
Well, who knows? I mean, I hope not. But yeah, so it's really a vision of the early 20th century in the world of when colonialism was still in flower, just before World War I, and there's a lot of wonderful descriptions of sailing around the Pacific. I mean, if you like to sail, you hear all kinds of information about navigation and techniques of sailing and geography of these islands. I mean, it pays to be able to have a general sense of the Western Pacific. You can look it up on Google Maps and identify the islands that are mentioned in these stories, and you have a better sense of them.
This is like a subset of the colonialistic themes that we were talking about, but it was interesting to kind of see the cultures in transition in relation to like the missionaries, you know, and 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 what that it's just not something I think a lot about. It encouraged me to perhaps explore that topic a little more one day because it's just like I was born into a world where this had already occurred, and you don't think about back and forth nature of it, the subsuming of certain rites and rituals into the, or the similarities between the cultures, or the dissimilarities, or the relapsing. I found
Yeah.
it wasn't a heavy theme, but I found that theme to be kind of intriguing.
Yeah, I mean, the England in particular sent out a lot of missionaries into Polynesia, and by this point it was like the third or fourth generation of missionaries who would come out. I guess they started in the late 18th, early 19th century, and a lot of them were very dedicated, and some of them gave their lives to bring education and Christianity to these peoples. But I mean, it was like a prime target for England and to a certain extent American missionaries. Of course, Hawaii was run by American missionaries for a long time in conjunction with the native chiefs there, and of course, London himself was not religious. I mean, he knew a lot about Christianity. He knew the Bible, but he was, he's kind of a naturalist. So his world is pretty much one determined by environment, and character, and but he's not a really uh, he's not like Dreiser or Frank Norris in the kind of sense of the sort of restrictions in that that dominate lives. I mean, there's a little more free will involved in London's world than the classic naturalists of Norris, Crane, and Dreiser. So,
So how would you describe London's conceptions of race?
yeah,
Judging
well,
for this text and the entirety of his canon, I guess.
the first thing I'd like to say is if anyone wants to explore this issue, there's a really great book out on the subject, which I read recently, called Jack London's Racial Lives by Jean Campbell Reisman, who teaches or taught down in San Antonio, Texas. And it's really a fascinating story because London was kind of a crucible for all the kind of racial currents of his time because there was the eugenics movement in the late 19th century, the sense of white supremacist beliefs in the early 20th century when there was a huge amount of immigration into the U.S. and there was this reaction against that, and then restrictive laws against immigration in the 1920s. So London grew up with a mother. He was abandoned by his likely father, this guy William Cheney, and he grew up with a stepfather, John London, and his mother, Flora Wellman, was from kind of an old stock family from Ohio, and then originally, part of the colonial Massachusetts. And so his mother thought of herself as this kind of pure Anglo-Saxon character, and she kind of preened herself on her racial heritage. So London got exposed to that as a young man, and as someone who really was kind of an orphan, he sort of seized on that as an identity. He also read Herbert Spencer and embraced originally the idea of social Darwinism, and the inevitable working out of the laws of evolution of you know fitter individuals overcoming the unfit. But then, interestingly enough, as a baby, London was breastfed. He was wet nursed by a black ex-slave um, named Virginia Prentice, who was a neighbor. And he always thought of Virginia Prentice, this black woman who was married to a sort of light-skinned black man. He always thought of her as kind of his second mother. So he kind of was exposed to this two different worlds. And this woman, Virginia Prentice, would tell him stories about escaping from slavery after the Civil War and coming west. And so, he had the seeds of a sort of multicultural perspective planted as a child. And then growing up in San Francisco, of course, he was exposed to all of the immigrants coming into that area, Italians and Portuguese and Japanese and Chinese and Greek. And so he depicts all these people, all these ethnic groups, and in most of his career, he's very fair-minded, and he's trying to sort of promote understanding in the stories by adhering to ideas of justice. But the interesting thing is, he was a writer who really had to make money to support all his projects and himself and his extended family. So occasionally he would turn to popular fiction motifs, in which case he would revert to sort of these racial stereotypes. And so stories like novels like Adventure or the Mutiny of the Elsinore, novels that no one very much reads today, have very distinctly sort of white supremacist ideas behind them. They're not nakedly racist, but they kind of rely on formulaic ideas about the white superiority. But that wasn't the heart of his fiction. The heart of his fiction is very enlightened, multicultural. He was a socialist who promoted justice for the working classes, throughout most of his adult life. And it's interesting because he was part of an organization to promote Pan-Pacific understanding, because he had covered the Russian-Japanese War in 1904, 1905. He knew that part of the world. He spent time in Korea covering that war. And yet, in the early 20th century, he promoted this idea of peoples of the Pacific, understanding and learning from each other. So defusing the kind of racial tensions that were apparent, certainly in California with the Chinese Exclusion Act and prejudices against Japanese as well. So he was quite enlightened for his time, and his best fiction shows it. So you kind of get a gamut of racial views from that time period, but London was always sort of in the vanguard of promoting ideas of racial justice in most of his fiction, certainly in his South Sea fiction. Also in his Klondike fiction, he's very sympathetic to the Native American peoples that some of whom are exploited in those stories. But it's a fascinating subject and quite timely for kind of what we're going through today in terms of the virtues of multiculturalism and their backlash against that idea.
So, saying all of that, how does that affect our estimation and the legitimate ranking or objective, if there is such a thing, perception of this text within the London canon?
Yeah, so I think anyone who doesn't know London's fiction, apart from this kind of cliche of that he's a kind of boys writer, or for sort of junior high school kids who read the Call of the Wild, I mean, that's something that is totally ridiculous because, first of all, you can read the Call of the Wild at any age and get a lot out of it. You can read it, as a fully mature human being and still realize it as a classic. So, London South Sea Stories it just widens your perspective on this man as a pioneer of sort of cultural understanding amongst all the different races and cultures of the world. I mean, it's not like he's trying to make it all fit together nicely, but he's promoting the idea of equity and fairness and understanding. You know, basically understanding people who are different from you, not hating them, not attacking them, just trying to figure out who they are as people. Um, and you know, endless sympathy for the underdog. That's his big message because he himself grew up as a very poor orphan child and well abandoned by his real father and did a lot of really uh, demeaning manual labor before he was able to even go to high school, and then he did a little bit of college, but couldn't afford it, so that you know he was pretty much self-educated throughout his life, and he was just an omnivorous reader. I mean, he was reading you know all the Western canon throughout his life, and very well read in history and philosophy. You know, he read Jung right about 1915, just before he died, and Jung kind of opened up his mind to the idea of the collective unconscious and the fact that all people have these archetypes in their minds, and sort of reminded him of his ecumenical vision of the world. So you know, he's an author that really deserves a wider readership. I mean, for a long time in the 20th century, he was the most popular American writer around the world. I don't know. I don't think that's as true today. I was just checking on the you know the most popular writer, American writer in the world, and is James Patterson. You know, and Daniel Steele is another probably that has sold the most books as an American writer of fiction. So those are you know very you know popular writers, but they're not. They have no depth compared to someone like Jack London.
So, people who would be interested, if you're making the case for individuals to read him today, I mean, I hear what you're saying that he's ultimately a champion of modern multiculturalism um, and sympathy for the common man. Are there some other reasons why readers of today would take an interest in Jack London?
Well, he's entertaining. He knows how
Mhm.
to write stories. He's has a wonderful sense of character and plotting and setting and language. Um, there's a very crispness to his style. He's very readable, but he's not superficial. He's always has some very suggestive, you know, imagery and a sort of poetic sense of language that carries you along in your reading of him. So yeah, you know, he's totally self-taught writer and and just a you know wonderful stylist, I think, as well.
I would agree with all of that. So, I think we've been going for I don't know 45, 50 minutes or so. I didn't know if we left anything on the table here that you wanted to discuss further, Dr. Cook.
Well, let's just see. We've talked about most of the stories, but we haven't we haven't said anything about the feathers of the sun, which is
Okay.
about a funny story about an Irish con artist who takes over sort of the economy of a trading station of these native peoples and
Oh, yes.
starts enforcing all these ridiculous rules and fines and impounding of traders' vessels if they don't pay the fine. And he kind of, it shows you a white European just kind of going crazy with power because of their ability to kind of hoodwink the native chieftains there and saying, I can improve your profit here, and I can do this and I do that, and then so it's a funny story about how this this guy gets tricked into losing his position. He calls himself the Feathers of the Sun. Is kind of a glorious nickname, and how David Grief manages to, through political savvy, to convince the native chief that this guy is not doing him any favors in what he's doing to his country, and he's not going to help him out financially either. So this guy is humiliated and disgraced, and there's this idea of hitting him with a dead pig, which I guess represents a kind of supreme insult, to be hit with a dead pig. But it's kind of the the biter bit, this moral of the villain who gets displaced because of he overreaches in his dastardly. He's not an evil character, but he's greedy and power crazed, and it shows David Grief and this native chief working together to eliminate this guy who was just turned up to exploit a situation where he could, use his knowledge of the area to insinuate himself into the power structure. So it's it's a moral parable, but it's also quite amusing as well, because it's so bizarre, this guy, but they're very believable in terms of what happens when people go crazy over power. This happens to people who have an opportunity, and there's no pushback. So
he was supposedly doing it in the name of or for the sake of these natives.
Yeah,
right.
Right. He's trying to pretending that he's going to help them, but he's really screwing them over in the end. So there's a good mix in this collection of serious moral parables, adventure stories of the downside of colonialism, amazing descriptions of a tropical storm in the Pearls of Parlay, and just the incredible power of these typhoon winds that just blow down all the palm trees, and sink all the ships, and just extreme weather, which is something obviously we're getting more and more familiar with. So it's a nice range of subjects and characters, and certainly something to read alongside South Sea Tales, which was the first collection. But I think in terms of philosophical depth, maybe a little more impressive in terms of storytelling. But this is certainly has got some wonderful examples.
Yeah, Feathers of the Sun was a good one. Especially the reveal and how they exposed this Irishman.
Yeah, right. Yeah, it kind of reminds me of some Melville characters in like Omu, when the main character there, Omu, and Dr. Long Ghost are kind of on the make as beachcombers, and the sort of tricks they play on people, the tricks that are played on them. I mean, there's no serious exploitation going on, but it's sort of the same kind of world of freewheeling, beachcombing kinds of Europeans.
Yeah, I would definitely say that this one gave me strong Melville vibes.
Yeah.
So, do we know anything about the relationship between those two?
Well, London loved Melville. He read Typee, and So yeah, Melville was in his mind as he was writing about the South Seas, but of course there was no opportunity for them to know each other. Melville was dead in 1891. London was 15 years old.
Yeah, I
Uh,
was just thinking more about whether or not London acknowledged the influence of Melville on his work
he
anywhere
mentions
explicitly.
he mentions him, but it's an influence, but it doesn't like dominate his writing at this point. Um,
Do do we know? I mean, I'm sure we do. Do we know who London did cite as like his intellectual mentors or his prime
well,
influences?
he was reading a lot of boys' adventure books about the South Seas and from the mid late 19th century. Uh, authors are not very well known today. A bunch of English authors. Uh, there was I'm blanking on some of the names, but certainly a very active. I mean, he's reading a lot of Kipling too. Kipling was a huge influence in the 1890s. Kipling was the great English writer of short fiction, and London was learning a lot from him. So, some of the colorful names like the proud goat of Aloysius Pankburn. I mean, that's a very Kipling-esque title because it's got the English sounding name. It's like, what is this all about? It's like an absurdist little title for a story that you have to sit down and read to know what what the title is all about. So yeah, I would say Kipling was a very strong influence that that London was reading, throughout his life because Kipling was writing far beyond when London died. Um, so
Well, I think it's a pretty productive conversation, Dr. Cook. I just want to make sure that we
yeah,
covered
I think we
everything you wanted
covered
to cover.
definitely.
All right. Well, I look forward to hearing some feedback and hoping that you all enjoy the audiobook and this presentation that we've done for you. And Dr. Cook and I will powwow, and perhaps we'll be back here sometime soon with a new discussion for you. Thank you, Dr. Cook.
Sure, thank you.
All right.